The hard thing is watching the live stream, watching videos back that have been posted, is that you can tell actively after the fact is that he's bobbing his head. There's no splash coming from that. There was more of a splash from a spectator that jumped in to notify somebody on a paddleboard than him actually drowning. Nationers, welcome back into another episode of The Realest Podcast, episode 62, Nationers. I hope you guys are all doing well, doing swell. It is great to see you guys back here again. I know it's been about 3 months or so since we've actually recorded a podcast episode. It is kind of been difficult to record in this room because like half of it is used for storage. And that just kind of piled up right after I recorded the last episode. So the unfortunate part is that we recorded that episode where we talked about like the whole Drake and Kendrick beef, and then it got piled up again. And I just hadn't really touched it. At that point, I had also been moving my setup from downstairs into my room. So then I also had to clean my room, and then this room never got cleaned up until this last week. So it's been about 3 months, Nationers. And yes, I feel like that timeline could have gone on a little bit sooner. So I do apologize that it took quite some time. There we go. Okay, cool. I just didn't want my cord to be stuck around the table. As you guys can tell, if you guys have watched the podcast before, you guys maybe, I don't know. I'm still experimenting on what this setup truly looks like because I want it to still be awesome in a way that looks cool, obviously with all the photos and pictures of all of our guests around here. But I also want to feel like there's a presence for an individual person. I feel like there's been moments where I had like just myself on one side and then, you know, kind of stuck up into the corner, and then that, I don't know, it just didn't feel right for a solo person. So this to me, I don't know. Let me know first and foremost if this is like the angle and kind of look and feel that you would want for these solo podcasts or just me talking, obviously. I feel like they're really nice. I feel like they have like a good connection. I feel just like looking straight into the camera is the look. But let me know. Nationers, today, I just got back earlier this week from Texas. I was down in Fort Worth for the CrossFit Games. I was really looking forward to it. And today we're going to kind of talk about not only the trip, what we did, but also the CrossFit Games as a whole, and maybe a little bit of the tragic downfall that is to come of CrossFit. Now, do I think that there's a downfall of CrossFit? That's one thing to look at and to look at and analyze, that is, about CrossFit and the events that went on that led to a death of one of their athletes. Nationers, I want to preface this that there might be a handful of you who may be watching that are new to this channel or new to this podcast, or maybe the clip that might come out from this. But I just want you guys to know that I'm well aware that maybe I don't have all the details. I was a spectator in all of this, so I feel like I have a very unique lens into this this year's games. I'm going to kind of start off with some context of myself as a CrossFit fan, what I do as an athlete, and what I've done as an athlete prior to today. So one of the biggest things that I had done growing up was track and field. Now, track and field, for this sake, is kind of the sport that I had done for most of my life. I had also played soccer or baseball, a little bit of basketball. Basketball is like one of my true loves of sports right now. But the biggest thing is that I was a track athlete. Now, I did track in high school, or middle school, high school, and in college. And after college, I graduated and obviously wasn't doing track and field anymore. And so what I was doing during that summer of 21 was I was like, okay, well, I want to do some type of race. And I've told the story before, but I ended up coming across Spartan races. And that's kind of what I do now, is obstacle course races. And so if you don't know what Spartan or even Tough Mudders or anything obstacle course racing that you may have done, you know, on like a July day just for fun, this is kind of like a cross-country race where you're running, but there's also obstacles in the way. So there's a lot of mud. There's a lot of carrying things. There's a lot of climbing over and going over things. That's kind of the biggest and easiest way to summarize Spartan racing. Now, from there, I kind of got really enamored and really, really into just Spartan and what it was, the athletes. And I stumbled upon a video and a series, kind of like what they do in their off season. And they do these Spartan Games. They haven't had it in like a year or two, but the Spartan Games had an athlete named Corinna Coffin. And I just happened to like follow her after the Spartan Games and see what she was up to, because she's not really like a Spartan athlete. She does a lot of like tactile game stuff, and she had like a big enough presence that she was invited onto the show, did really well. And, you know, I don't know if she had won. I don't think she did. I think she was top 3 at least out of the 8. So she finished really well, ended up following her. And now in 22, after doing a handful of Spartan races, I stumbled upon one of her stories. And one of her stories was cheering on one of her friends or somebody that she had supported named Daniel Brandon. Now, if you've watched CrossFit, you would know of Daniel Brandon. Daniel Brandon is one of the elite individual women that has qualified for a handful of years. And that was the woman that had got me into CrossFit. I had family, and I've had cousins that have done CrossFit before, and they've been doing like WODs all the time. But, you know, I'd also done, when I was starting CrossFit, when I was starting Spartan, that's what I meant to say, I had gone to a CrossFit gym. So I knew a little bit about like CrossFit. I'd gone to a like CrossFit affiliate, gone to open gym, and was working on my Spartan stuff. So I was climbing a lot of things. I was lifting a lot of things. I was running a lot. And that's kind of what I was doing. So not only as a spectator, I've been in a CrossFit gym, but not really during CrossFit classes where they're doing like WODs during the day. I've done one WOD in my life. One. And the thing is I would like to say that for myself, I'm not a CrossFit fan that is like super like deep into like the community. And I think this weekend that changed. Now, over the past 2 years of watching, being involved in CrossFit, excluding the year that I was in like a gym. I wasn't in a gym for super long, but regardless, over the past 2 years that I was watching and spectating, I ended up watching all of the 22 games, watching all the documentaries up until now. And the biggest thing was that when the next CrossFit Games rolled around, I actually bought myself and my sister tickets to go to the game. Now, we didn't have like the best of seats. We were like back against the wall in section 200 and like 13. And so we're up against the wall in the very back. Me and my sister, we're just enjoying the games. Like, it was a ton of fun. And not only that, but the venue was really awesome. In Madison, they had the field, they had the vendors, and they had the arena. Like, it was just perfect. Now, as that year gone by, I was like, okay, I'm starting to understand a lot of these athletes. I'm starting to understand like what prep, what type of workouts that they're doing, because I also want to like learn about the sacrifices that they're making to get to this point. And so one of the biggest things for me as a fan and a spectator that I've really started to learn, and kind of like what I've tried to transpire into my workouts, is like having the engine, having that aerobic capacity. And the biggest thing that I started doing was watching the Open. I really got involved into watching the Open. I really watched, I think it's quarterfinals after, excuse me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe it's that, quarterfinals, semifinals, and then the games. And now at every benchmark or every competition that they have or qualification, there's always cuts. There's a percentage of people that go, and then there's a numerical amount that go. So I believe it's after Open, it's 25%, which was an increase, which I've, kind of been like, oh, okay. So it seems like a lot of people don't really like that and whatnot. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from. I'm just coming from, hey, okay, so it increased. I'm not really like getting the reaction of the community, but I can understand this or that, pros and cons behind it. So Open increased, going on to quarterfinals. After quarterfinals, I believe they took the top 40 women and men in each region. So Asia, Europe, East and West America, Africa. They also had parts of South America and Oceania and a whole bunch of different regions across the world. But they basically took a handful of teams as well. So they took 40 athletes from each region on the men's, women's, and there's a certain amount of number of teams that also qualified. And then from there, they basically took a certain amount. So each region got a different amount. So it's not just like top 10 go. Like for one region, it could be 9, and another region, it could be 5, and it could also be like 5 men and 6 women. And I don't exactly know how they grade that. I think it's off like a global scale and global ranking and, where the strengths are, because the biggest thing is that if they have, let's say, Asia, which I know gets, I think, 2 individuals on the women's side. And so that's not like, quote unquote, the strongest global, how would I say it? That's not the word, but that's not where the strength is. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that they're trying to make sure that it's weighted in a way, right? So it's not just like 5 all across the board, because people are going to shuffle and shift and be like, oh, my best chance in this region or that region. So the biggest thing is that it's weighted in a way. So like I said, there's going to be differences between the men's and women's side. There's going to be differences between each region, and I think even also teams as well. And so I started watching all of that going into the semifinals, and then after the semifinals, you qualify for the games. Now, one of these athletes from the games in Europe on the men's side won his first or back-to-back, maybe 3 times. I could be wrong on the number, but his name's Lazar Ðukić, and he won again in the European division on the men's side. And not only that, his brother also qualified again for his last time being in 21 and then up until this year. So it's been about 2 years since he's qualified for the games. And so obviously this is like super cool. I watched a behind the scenes by Craig Ritchie, who is a weightlifter over in the European scene and also covers a lot of CrossFit post weightlifting career, and obviously maybe not doing it as much. He's been making a lot of videos, covering a lot of CrossFit and a lot of this scene. So all of this to say, not only with the community of just CrossFit, there is a lot of like crossover within hybrid racing and like High Rocks and Spartan and Tough Mudder, but there's also professional powerlifters and weightlifters that are also enamored in the CrossFit scene. We love to see good competition. We love to see people at their peak fitness in a way. That's why I love Spartan races. That's why I love CrossFit. That's one of the reasons why I love CrossFit, is I love seeing all of these athletes in so many different fields, whether that's a more heavy gymnastics workout, pure strength and like a max deadlift type workout, but also being able to do biking and cycling, or also in this case, the first event down of this games was a run swim. Now, I want to preface this first and foremost because I love triathlons. I'm planning on doing my first one either this year or next year, but I've always loved biking and I've loved cycling. And so one of the biggest things even this Olympics was I watched a lot of cycling. Also, I watched a lot of triathlons. I watched both the women's and the men's triathlons in this year's Olympic cycle. Now, the reason why I bring up triathlons is because some triathlons and biathlons that don't include either the cycling or the swim, some of them still begin with a run. So some triathlons, if it's non-cycling, because cycling can be kind of expensive, so, swimming's a decently cheaper price point for a lot of people, and also running's decently cheap as well, comparatively to renting a bike or buying a bike and, buying a helmet and buying shoes if you wear shoes, and obviously a lot more accessories that come with that than just running and swimming. Most people have access to that. So one of the biggest things that I want to touch on is the difference between run, swim, runs, and obviously just a run, swim, right? Not that there's much difference. And a lot of people are going to point to this first event being like, oh, maybe not like the greatest idea to have a run swim. Now, somebody that has watched a lot of triathlons, had friends that have ran a bunch of triathlons, even without the biking portion, it is a lot more common for, it's a lot more common than people would presume for running to be before swimming in some triathlons. Now, a normal triathlon goes swimming, biking, running. That is a very traditional triathlon. That's just how that works. And I want to touch on the first event and the tragedy that had occurred on the day. So basically, me and my mom had flown down really late night. It's like 12, 1 o'clock by the time we get to the hotel. And we check in. We immediately go to bed. Well, she immediately goes to bed. I don't go to bed until like 3 o'clock. And mind you, it's a 2-hour time difference. I live in the Pacific Standard Time. So it's about a 2-hour time difference. I maybe slept a little bit on the second flight, but I didn't sleep a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. And I slept enough the night before traveling too. So I was hoping that like if I got enough sleep, I'd be able to like stay up on the plane and then pass out once I got into the hotel bedroom. Now, I woke up around 8:30. The first event or coverage was to begin at 7 a.m. local time, which would have been 5 p.m. my time. But regardless, 7 a.m. local time was when coverage had began for the CrossFit Games. And I was super excited about it. I hadn't planned on going to the lake. I thought it was going to be like a 30-minute drive. I ended up looking up the reservoir that they were swimming in. And I was like, oh, it's only like 5-6 miles. Maybe I could Uber. I was thinking about it, and I ended up not going, right? So I was not at the event on the first day. And a part of me is like, what would change if I was, you know? And I think a lot of people have this thought of like, what would have changed if I had gone to the event, or if I didn't go to the event, or if I had spoke up or done this. There's a lot of what ifs, right? There's so many different scenarios that could have happened. And I don't know if this is like the movie, like, you know, plot line going in my head, like, oh, what about if I like had gone and that changed like everything? And mind you, who knows? That's the biggest thing. There is so many what ifs, and I'm kind of skirting around everything that had happened on event 1. But if you know, you know, but I'm going to explain it here in somewhat of a summary and what had happened in the events that had led on. So I started watching, I think, as some athletes were coming out of the water. So what I naturally do is I rewind on my phone during breakfast, and I'm just like watching. I'm like, okay, they're in the swim portion now. Let's see all the athletes start coming out. I see Jelle Hosta come out, who was the first male and athlete across the finish line. And then I see Tia Toomey. I figured she would be really good at some of these swimming events. She always is in open water. And I'm not really... I didn't watch any of the run, by the way, and I probably will never see any light of the day of the run other than like footage that, you know, videographers had taken and had posted. But I'm just saying that just to say that I never knew who was in first. It's a 3.5 mile run. Didn't really care to watch it. But the biggest thing was there was an 800-meter swim to finish off the event. And now I will say, even watching Wadapalooza, where like the swim during that last year was just a down and back, this one was kind of like connecting 2 points. So I'm trying to get from this picture to that picture. It's not like where I go, you know, out and back or connect. It's just straight across. So there's a lot more room for air in a way. That's kind of like putting that slight. There's a lot more room for disaster to strike because there's a larger area to cover. It's not so densely compact. And one of the athletes, Lazar Ðukić, had been swimming about 700 meters in. And apparently, from videos that I saw retroactively, after, you know, things had transpired, he was starting to struggle. And it wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't say that this is uncommon, you know, especially when you're fatigued. You've ran, obviously, a good amount of distance, especially if you're near the top, like 5, top 10 out of 80 athletes. You've probably ran a pretty significant 3.5 mile run, right? And so the biggest thing that I've heard post race was that even like Jeffrey Adler, who was the reigning male from last year, he was in first going into the water, and he finished like 15th out of the men, if I'm not wrong. But he did not finish first, is what I'm meaning to say. He had also struggled and had his own experience in the water, but Lazar Ðukic's unfortunately ended up very catastrophic. And I can only imagine what drowning is like. I've had moments even as like an infant, from even just like remembering like drowning. And one of the biggest things about drowning is that you don't scream for help. You don't. That's just not a very common line of thought unless you do it early. And so what I mean by that is if we'll just take a minute period of struggle, maybe even 30 seconds. The first 10 seconds are the most crucial. The earlier, the better, basically is what I'm saying. But by then, you don't really realize that you're drowning in a way. You're just trying to stay afloat. And so a lot of this, when he is changing his stroke or just feels like he's not swimming like you had just done for 700 meters beforehand. So again, that early initial period of realizing that you are struggling and drowning, even experiencing heat exhaustion, especially with the heat temperature of the water, the outdoor environment, especially it's starting at 7 a.m. and you have over an hour before that even had gone into the water. And so again, all this to say that earlier the better. But by 20 seconds and 30 seconds, you realize that like you're just trying to fight for air. Yes, your initial thought is like to try and scream for help, but if you scream for help, you're not getting air into your lungs. And so that's why I say, in my experience in drowning in some way or feeling some fatigue and not being able to swim on my own, is that the earlier the better, but mentally you don't realize that you are. So it's really hard to like know that you're struggling and that leads into deeper and darker waters. So the hard thing is watching the live stream, watching videos back that have been posted, is that you can tell actively after the fact is that he's bobbing his head. There's no splash coming from that. There was more of a splash from a spectator that jumped in to notify somebody on a paddleboard than him actually drowning. And mind you, he was top 5, even on the men's side. And the hard part is that you see Tia come out of the water. You see, I don't know if it was Ricky Garrard. There was another athlete right behind her that had finished, like just right with each other. And in the background, right in the gaze of right under the awning of the finish line, you could see his head bobbing. But there's no like splash, like somebody trying to tread water, or help. There's really none of that. And so, yes, I understand that like there's a world where that changes, or there's some reason to believe why nobody helped, or didn't see it, because if he's just bobbing and it's just his head and he goes under, what's left? There's not a ripple. There's not a wake of water being splashed up right there. But people up above can see it, and they're trying to yell, but I'm sure there was loud music. I'm sure, I don't know, like air travels and sound travels a little differently on water. And I've had experiences like that where I've been on the water and I've heard my family on a boat trying to scream to us, and we're like, oh, hey, but we can't hear them. And so there's just like this mess of different scenarios and different environments of what's going on that led to the drowning of Lazar Ðukić. And so I base this all on my experience, right? I was not at the event. I watched back the stream, and the darkest thing that I just will forever live in my mind is I just remember I'm eating breakfast at the hotel, and I pick up my phone, throw away my trash, and I start walking back to my room. And right as I pick up my phone, I remember Chase Ingram, one of the commentators of this year's games, had mentioned, oh, we haven't seen Lazar Ðukić cross the finish line. And at the time, I didn't think of it. I didn't think 2 seconds of it. I didn't know that he had a water polo background. If anything, that makes him like one of the stronger swimmers, right? Just naturally. And I know he's one of the better runners. His anaerobic capacity is really good. He did really well on the bike the year beforehand. And I just, I look at that in hindsight, right? And I'm just like, oh. And then I start watching all these, little stories pop up. And I just remember I was about to go change into some normal clothes than my pajamas. And I just remember like sitting there on the bed and then the live stream just turned off. I was like, that's weird. Maybe it just went down. Like in my mind, I'm like, they're at a lake. It's kind of hard maybe to get reception. I understand. Like I would understand if that's the case. But then I realized like, oh, like the live stream's not even up anymore. And so then red flag, flare light went up. I'm like, maybe I'll go into the next live stream. And it would happen to be like the Thursday midday. And I was going into the comments and I'm starting to read them like, oh, is anyone like, what happened? Like, maybe, and mind you, I was just trying to go back into the live stream recording that, comes up, the VOD, the video on demand, and that wasn't there, like I said. So I go in and I'm like, yo, like what's going on? And people were starting to become aware of that one athlete is missing. I've seen people say that two's missing, like Henrik Hopalainen happened to be one of them. I don't exactly know what his scenario and his situation was, but what I'm trying to say is that the flare light was up and there was a response. There happened to be something catastrophic that had happened, that they took down the live stream, they took it off ESPN, they took it off Twitch, they took it off everything. There was no simple footage of this just like right away. And so some people happen to get footage of the moment and when the spectator jumped in and all this different stuff. And I feel for a lot of people in that situation, I feel for the lifeguard, retroactively in hindsight of like, I keep using that word retroactively, but I feel for like people in those positions who had to make a decision and it just so happens that they made the wrong one. Now, throughout that day, things had ended up getting canceled. Things had gone on where I was like, oh, so what's going to happen at the games? Like, what's going to happen? They ended up canceling everything on day one. That includes, obviously, the events and the activities at the vendor village and just different things across, like, CrossFit that day. And obviously, as we've come to find out that there's one athlete missing. His name's Lazar Ðukić, right? He's not just like somebody's that you don't really know of him, right? Now, I'm sure most people can probably honestly admit that they don't necessarily know some of the athletes that come out of Brazil or Asia or even Africa. But the thing is that regardless of, and this is what I try and think about, is because I obviously canceled things on day one and we're like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? They ended up continuing the games. But I'm like, what would have happened if that was, let's say it's a name, like I think of this somewhat in a cynical way, but like if that happened to like a top athlete, what's the response? Like what happens? But what if that happens to somebody who's going to, be potentially towards the bottom of the leaderboard? What happens? Is there a right answer to that? Is there a wrong answer to that? And to that, I don't exactly know. I don't know. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, what if that happened to like Tia Claire Toomey, right? Like what happens if that happened, right? And that's all just like what ifs. But sometimes you kind of have to think that way. And it feels cynical to think that way. But it's not like Lazar was like the top athlete. But it's not like he was a nobody. He was probably going to at least place top 10, if not top 5 that year. So he's not just like somebody who maybe it's like first year at the games. He's been there a handful of times. And so I feel for the athletes. I feel for people that had to make decisions after the fact. And obviously I watched the press conference with Don Fall and Dave Castro talking about it. And a lot of people, especially like early on, are like, say his name. Like, you know who it is. But here's the thing. When you know that somebody is drowned and you found a body that potentially links it to that disaster of somebody drowning, somebody missing, it is not up to you to decide whether their name should be public or not. Now, obviously, if you know the name, that's one thing. But it's the family's decision for that to be public. That is just simple, like, that's just how that works, regardless of if you know them or not. It is the family's decision to make that information public. So when CrossFit Games and the CrossFit account on Instagram come out with a post being like, we are saddened by one of our athletes, and you were in the comments being like, oh, say his name, he deserves better than this. That is not your place to say. And so I'm sure, and this is just me being a little pessimistic, but I'm sure a lot of those people who had said say his name are in other comment sections being like, I respect the athletes that didn't continue. The CrossFit Games shouldn't have gone on, right? None of these decisions are, even myself, I have a say in it, but is my say like fractional? It probably is, right? Do I agree if the game should have gone on or not? I think in the moment, it's hard for me as a spectator who's bought a ticket, who has made a whole trip out of this, whose mom hasn't been on a trip or a vacation in some time. That it was like a full vacation. I have such a unique situation. There's people that I met at a quick trip across the street that flew in from the UK. There's a lot of decisions to be made. There's a lot. And so from the knowledge that I know and the coverage that I watched and part of the process that I had seen is after we had found out that Lazar Ðukić had drowned, people had been evacuated by then. They had just come out with a press conference about the drowning. And so one of the biggest things, was that speculation obviously started to begin. We ended up finding out that it was him. And so I guess the timeline for just me and part of what was going on at CrossFit and at the arena was I feel for a lot of the athletes, first and foremost. They had to make a decision of whether if they want to continue, whether if the game should continue, because even for Ðukić, his brother who had just drowned, he wanted the games to continue. But did he compete? No. And I think people could still have that opinion where they feel like the game should have gone on or some part of it should have been moved forward, but didn't continue themselves. And that's very okay. And there are some people that were outright like, I know this is wrong. Like somebody died, and they don't want the games to continue. And that's very much a decision that, and an opinion that somebody could have. And again, like for myself, where, we've spent thousands of dollars to come down here, buy a hotel. Me and my mom had obviously both bought tickets to the game, and I was really looking forward to it. I was looking forward for my mom to see her cousins and to spend time with her loved ones. And it's a very unique perspective that I think every single athlete, spectator, person watching had. And for my own, I can only speak on that. And the biggest thing, I need to turn on my auto lock like a lot higher. But so basically after that, I told my mom, I didn't tell her like right away, but I told my mom. We ended up going into the pool, and that was pretty fun. She'd gone in. I was like, oh, okay, I'll go in. And then we went to Whataburger, and then after that, we just kind of waited. We have no idea. And at that point, there wasn't really speculation on if there were going to continue or not. We just had no idea what was going to go on, right? Obviously, those are the two choices. Are they going to continue it or are they not going to continue it? Those are just basically the two choices that were at play, but it wasn't really like a thought, We're like, what? Dude, it's like somebody drowned, And it's so saddening because his girlfriend's there, fiance girlfriend, but then also his brother, somebody he's been with for 20 plus years, 25 plus years of his life, And so we waited. I ended up going to Quick Trip. I grabbed a pizza. I was like, well, the worst case scenario is we have a flight out Monday. We just spend our time in Fort Worth and we just do something else. Hopefully we get a refund on our tickets. And I could see a world where that was the result of everything, where they were like, hey, we're going to cancel the games. You'll get a refund on your tickets. All the sponsors, I don't know, they're going to pay them back for buying a spot. I don't know. I don't know what that would have looked like logistically, but I see a world where that would have been a reality. And so then after the Quick Trip, I ate some pizza. It's 5:00 by now. I'm just continuing to wait. I'm just checking all these people's different posts and what, Rebecca Fuselier, looks different than how it's pronounced. Rebecca's Instagram, I'm looking up different morning chalk. I start following accounts just to stay updated on all the stories. And, I saw Ricky Garard's post, he was praying for my good mate, Lazar. And I'm just damn, the thing is before the body was found, and mind you, we had no idea if that body was his or whatnot. 50 meters out from the finish line, if not a little more. It's so sad because like I feel for the athletes thinking about it, like they just swam right over him and they have no idea. They hope that everyone gets from point A to point B. That's the reality. And due to, in my opinion, a lot of negligence of whether that was planning, whether that was just, I don't know. It seems like a lot of it just happened to be like safety wise and protocol more than anything. I think a lot of it happened to be a little bit of the weather that day. It just happened to be right at that boiling point of the water may be too hot. They're also running beforehand. It was just this concoction of something's going to happen. And it just so happens that somebody drowned and something did happen. And so I caught wind that there was apparently these groups of people that had separated, and they were all going to come up with 5 people from the men's, women's teams and coaches to go up to Dave and be like, hey, what are we going to do? Not just Dave, I'm assuming, but that's what it said in the post. And so what ended up happening was the games continued. Now, I'm not going to get to day 2 because I do want to clear up maybe some things that I found and maybe something that might have maybe alter what you guys may have known prior to all of this. So some people are like, wow, I can't believe they put it on the athletes to make that decision. I understand that gripe. I understand the pushback by people that are like, why, like they're grieving. Why make them make a decision like that? And to that, I'm assuming that most of these people didn't watch the broadcast the day after. So I remember I watched none of the 2023 broadcast. I have no idea what was said other than me trying to find me and my sister in the bike, or the 5K that they had. And so I was like, okay, what did the tribute look like on camera? Because in the arena, it was, they showed like little Instagram posts. They had all the athletes come out in all black and, their country on their back. And they had like Go Ruck because that was a sponsor. I'm sure this is just uniforms that they were kitted out with. And they have like a moment of silence that felt like lasted like 8 minutes. Or 8 seconds. It did not last 8 minutes. But it was like 8 seconds. And I was like, really? Like, I would have, that just feels like half-baked. Like, I don't necessarily like the girl that does all the award stuff and talks about it. She just sounds very, like, teleprompty. It sounds so formal. It sounds like, she kind of sounds like is if, like, legal talk were a person. Like, where you can't take blame, but you're like, we are so saddened by the death of one of our athletes, Lazar Ðukić. And it's like, it doesn't feel genuine. It just feels like you're reading from it, and then that's just what, like, the internal dialogue of it. Like, if I were to say, so we are deeply saddened by, like, it sounds really weird. Like, So she did the moment of silence. She was over the intercom or whatever it was, the microphone, to, give a moment of silence and talk about a little bit about Lazar. And they had all the athletes walk on, moment of silence. They had them walk off. That was it. And then they showed all the Instagram posts of people talking about Lazar, their experience with him, or what's going on today. And it felt weird. It didn't feel at that point as if we had just like moved past it. We're just trying to brush it off, but it felt very like, just like I can't say that they didn't care because they did something, but it felt like they didn't care. Like that as an end result, they're like, it didn't feel like anything meaningful, It just didn't feel like anything of substance that I'm like, wow, that was a thoughtful gesture, The tribute, and I know Luca even talked about it, that the tribute was like, what are they just going to pay tribute to Lazar Ðukić and that's it? And then have a whole bunch of videos and posts about it? Is that like it was like the bare minimum of what they could have had. And it's sad. It's just like so sad that was the reality. And as a spectator, I'm like there and we like talk and like I'm talking to the people to my left and right. I'm like, damn, that feels like I would have loved if they had gone like for 3 hours. I would have loved if they had gone like way over the time and like took forever, to do it. Like gave like everyone a platform to go talk, like somewhat of like a funeral would be. Like an open format. But they gave it 8 seconds. maybe 8 minutes at most. And so that's sad, like just to see, like as a spectator in there. And so what I mean to say, and kind of to come back, is I ended up watching the second day, the Friday morning live stream. And it was like, maybe they had the tribute in it. And Mike, the commentator on there, he was talking about, oh yeah, so we just finished up the tribute. So they didn't have the tribute a part of the live stream. And maybe it was initially, but it wasn't in the VOD. Maybe they trimmed it out or something. And so they talked to Dave Castro. And Dave Castro, who programs a lot of these events, if you guys don't know, he's the programmer for every event from this to that. He ended up not doing, I think, 22 or maybe 22 or 23, whatever it was. But the thing was, there was a completely different outlook that I had after watching that short little interview. And it's not a Dave, it's not of anyone in particular, but it is about the process that had gone on. So again, to those people that are like, oh, like, why did they make the athletes? They did not make the athletes. And I want to make this very clear. They did not make the athletes make that decision. From watching Dave's interview of technically the first/second day of what had gone on, the first time right after, he talks about, he pulls Ðukić into whatever room they had gone in, whether it's somewhat formal or not. And he talks to Ðukić, the brother of Lazar. And they sit down. And I don't exactly know what the basis of the conversation was, but the brunt of it was Ðukić had wanted the games to go on. And this is Thursday after he had just lost his brother. And I understand if maybe in the moment, he wants to appeal or whatnot. It seemed like they had asked him a handful of times if, that was like your choice and that's what you want to see go on. And so basically, at the arena near the finish line, if you watch the CrossFit Games, they all move basically from left to right most of the time, and they all cross this little finish line platform. And the thing is that how would I say it? Right behind him is a whole bunch of fans, like the best spot in the house. They're all finishing right in front of you. They sit the athletes down there, teams and athletes. And I don't know if the coaches were in it. I believe they were, because I remember Dave calling them agents, but they were coaches. And so what had gone on was that they had all pulled him in and said, hey, the games are going to continue. And I don't know exactly who spoke up. This was very vague on Dave's part, but he was like, one of the athletes and maybe a handful of them were like, okay. Like it was kind of tense, and somebody ended up breaking the ice. And one of them spoke up and was like, hey, do we get an input in that? And what do you feel like the athlete should have an input in that or not? That is one thing. But we cannot place I guess in my eyes, I don't think we can place blame in those coordinating the process of what to do in this crisis management in a way. Because the athletes, if this story is true, the athletes also wanted a voice in this matter. So what ended up happening is there's basically a group of those men, women, coaches, and teams that all got separated into each corner, and then they basically all had their own discussion, like you would in class or something. And so what ended up happening is that, obviously, I think there was a few outspoken people that kind of led the charge, but that wasn't necessarily the right setting for some. A lot of those that didn't really feel like speaking up or were still trying to, get through the process. So some of them went up to Dave, is what he said, and then they ended up coming out with a survey where they can all post their thoughts and processes. And so they kind of have a batch of everyone, but then also have a batch of these groups. And what ended up happening is that each group selected 5 representatives, smaller each time. So the big groups of like 40 plus people, going in to then select 5 people that would represent them and what their group is. And so some people got up and left immediately before this process even had taken over. I don't exactly know who. Some people like Guy Maieros had came out and said like, hey, like he needs to step back. He needs to process this, and then came back and still competed. No, some athletes were a little bit more obvious on when they they competed a little bit and then withdrew. So all this to say that I wouldn't necessarily put anyone in blame for the athletes making the process or them making the process in CrossFit, because I feel like it was very much a mutual decision, right? There's no one to blame there. It seems like it was going to be without the athletes. The athletes wanted that. They gave them the best platform that they could have to make that decision. And again, I say this all because I feel like there's a lot of people out there in the comment section with such vitriol, just hatred spewing out of their thumbs, being like, I can't believe they let the games go on, or they should have canceled it. And to their point, I could agree where this shouldn't have been an athlete decision in the first place. I can completely agree with that. Where if they're like, no, as HQ, we are canceling them. I can see that being a completely fair reality and understand that, like, hey, this is on us. We understand, it's kind of like just like canceling an event. It's nothing more than that. Like, just because the patrons also want it to go on doesn't mean, it's just like if somebody canceled a show, it's nothing more or less like that. It's exactly like that. The venue or, the showrunner's like, hey, the show's canceled. Sorry. That's, and again, very real reality that could have been. But after a process and after another process, you get down into these different processes where each line of thought is thought out by a bunch of people, where it goes from just Dave and Luca, and then goes to Dave and the athletes, and then the athletes to athletes. And, again, there's a lot more outspoken people. Some people immediately left. Some people didn't feel comfortable competing. Some people, and I think there's an inflection point where the CrossFit Games are going to continue. What do I as an athlete do from here? Just because maybe my choice wasn't was to compete or wasn't to continue the games. Again, the same thing. What do I do as a person? I understand if the athlete to my left, to my right wants to compete. I understand, again, where the games could continue, but I don't compete. And a lot of the athletes, like Ariel Lowen, Jacqueline Dahlstrom, Emma Tall, these athletes who had actually competed in a few events post, drowning. Sorry if that sounds harsh. I don't mean it that way. But to then withdraw and then be like, it doesn't feel right. And that's okay. But it doesn't feel right because it felt like they were just moving past it as an organization or as an event. And to that, I agree. As a spectator, I obviously spent money to go there and be a part. And yes, there's something morally, overpowering of somebody's death, so tragic and so unpreventable, that how do I say this? That where's the line drawn between money and empathy, right? Is there a middle ground between that, right? It's just like when people give hush money, or it's just like when people, give hush money in a way to make sure that that story doesn't come to light, right? It's like, or maybe somebody sues somebody and then they get paid off, just to settle the court case, right? Where does money and empathy collide? And for Karen Frejova, a fellow Serbian athlete, she was very outspoken that she did not want the CrossFit Games to go on. She was very upset at the organization and wanted nothing to do with CrossFit. And to that point, one of my favorite athletes to watch, I completely understand that. As a fellow Serbian, yet alone, brother, yet alone family, but also from the same country, and probably has gone on through a lot of the same conversations as Lazar and his brother, or anyone in Europe, that is. I can understand that. And so when athletes obviously then continued in day 2, we had, I think I wrote the events here just because I wanted to see them. So they had midline climb, which was a really long event. Dave ended up coming out after a day in review saying that they had actually shortened it. They made it a lot easier, so a lot of people finished because he had predicted and kind of set it up where a lot of people would actually get capped. And to that point, whatever you think about that, but it happened to be a long event. They ended up changing a few things, and pretty much, obviously, Dave, in this case, wanted everyone to finish because they wanted to, feel like everyone accomplished the first workout, right? And so we ended up changing like 20 minutes before. And then after that, we had Firestorm. That was kind of like a very quick, like echo bike burpee event. Really, really quick. And then they had the track and field. And again, I'm a track guy. I loved that event. My family, my mom's family happened to be there. Her cousins and my second cousins happened to be there. And it just so happened that like they, especially with free entry, got in. And so we got to see all these amazing things. And I'm telling about like what's going on. And, it feels weird because like, when we got in after the tribute, especially with the commentators, commentating in arena, it felt very weird because, for one, they have to kind of be cheery. They have to be somewhat optimistic about things, and they're just commentating the event. They're like, oh, we got Justin Medeiros, going into his final set of, they can't really be like, oh, here we go. And so it happened to be a little bit more downtone that first event, but it very quickly, especially with Firestorm, because it was like Firestorm is literally just like a firestorm. That's the reason why it was. It was just a flurry of things going on at once. Off the echo bike, over into the burpees, on the echo bike, over into the burpees. So when I say that for some athletes like Ariel Lowen, athletes like Jack and Dahlstrom, Emma Tall, who had, competed for some events and then withdrew or, and it just didn't feel right. I completely understand where they're coming from because even as a spectator, it just felt like, and like they said it, these athletes, where it just felt like they were brushing over it. There wasn't like any tribute beyond that, or I don't know like how you work that in, or, I don't really know how you do it. Some athletes found their own way to do it. And for some athletes, it felt weird because they're posting on social media and, it felt weird because then they're getting slewed, and depending on the person, even if it's the same type of content where it's just their montage of the day and then maybe a caption about what went on, you'd get different types of comments under that. Like Brooke Wells was like, people were like, oh God, I don't even want to describe her comment section. But then people like, I don't know, like Ariel Lowen, who had posted maybe like one or two of hers, or Alex Gazan, like it was a completely different story. And so, and that just happened to be Instagram. Again, that is Instagram comments, but after like day 2, technically, it felt weird. Like I felt in like this weird spot, but the tone was getting up there every single time that an event had passed, if that makes sense. And so it felt very weird because I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, what is going on? I want to grieve about this, and it feels so sad. Like, I wish I could have done something about that, right? But it's like, I can't go and change that. And I feel like I have this really weird, like, Spider-Man, like, look at it, where I'm like, oh, I could have saved him, Like, I just have that, like, internal thought that just repeats in my head. And it was like that for, like, the entire weekend, where I'm like, what about if I went to that event? Would that have, like, changed anything? What about if I, like, walked? I took, like, the 4 or 5 mile walk, or took an Uber there and maybe just found a ride back. Does anything change? And that's the tragic part of grief. And that's the tragic part of losing someone like that in the way that they did. Like if something, like if it happened like a week prior as well, someone was down there and they just, got hit by a car or got into a car accident or, just where it felt like I couldn't do anything, right? And that's the thing. The negligence behind CrossFit and the setup of this event caused the preventable death of one of their athletes. And that's the reality that we have to live in. And so with that, I hope that somebody finds accountability. And there is accountability for the setup, the actions, whatever it may be. And I don't know if that's like somebody resigning. I don't know what type of change that looks like. I really don't. The biggest thing about all of this is that after day 2, day 3 felt like we were at a really weird turning point, but maybe for the better. Things had started to like settle. Like that first day, I'm like, this feels weird. Like, I don't really know what I want to do, and I don't really know what to do. I want to go do things, but I know that like one person and his family, like I just can't stop thinking about it, right? It was just like unavoidable, you know? And that's the toughest part of it all. So when day 3 comes by, like I said, I feel like the mood was that things had started to settle. Things were kind of like, okay, I'm kind of moved past this incident in a way, but like I'm still thinking about it. But I feel like the events also kind of made that, in a way, the reality for a lot of people, and especially for myself, because obviously we ended off on a high note with the track and field. I love track and field for myself and love watching it. But we had Chad, which is a hero workout, and then after that, a bunch of people withdrew because they, it didn't feel right. Like, it didn't feel like we were really honoring Lazar or honoring his memory or really doing anything to kind of put in place like any memoriam or memory. Like, we're playing like CrossFit Pictionary and CrossFit quizzes and trivia, and it's just like, I don't know, it just feels weird. And it started doing the GoFundMe stuff like that day, the day that it happened on that Thursday. But day 3, so this is Saturday now. Like I said, things had settled. We had done Chad. A lot of people were really like, oh, how is this going to be spectating? Is it going to be boring? Honestly, a super fun event to spectate. Like, honestly, super, super fun. Kudos out to the commentary on grounds, especially in the arena, because they made it very, very exciting. Like, 3 women were all in a race, and then 2 guys, Austin Hatfield and James Sprague. And Sprague came back from like an 8 rep deficit, but still had like 50 to go, so made that up. And the thing that I'm trying to say is that for people that were a critique and a critic of Chad and its spectatability, I thought it was really fun. I thought it was really, really fun, especially having like the double boxes. Prime. Super cool. Apparently it gotten leaked, and that's kind of the tough part about that, is that some people already knew about the event beforehand and how it was going to work. So it was a double box. So you go 2 over, down 2, up 2, down 2. So you do 4. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4 on the way back. And so you have to hit a magical number of 250 because it's a lot easier to count that instead of counting like 1, 2, 3. Oh, was I at 3 or 4? Super easy that way. Just count it 250, and they did 1,000 box step ups. It's kind of crazy if you ask me. They weren't super poignant on like hip extension. They just made sure that they were at boxes or certain areas on the box. They had to be on one half of the box going up and then the other half going down. So they go boom, boom, tiny, boom, boom, and then down. So super fun event to watch. Don't get me wrong. But then on top of that, they had clean ladder, which was kind of like a phase where it's like you have these semifinals, or you have like qualifications in a way like track would. Then you have semifinals and finals. And so the biggest thing about that was it was so electric because it was so fast. Like, some people went out really hot, and then you could tell like in the second heat that they were like, oh, they're going to hang on. Like, I don't know. And so they ended up doing that really quick, kind of like somewhat of a sprint. And then you kind of see who like maybe went out too hot and couldn't actually clean at the progressive loads. And then from there, they had the finale. And the finale was super fun because it was most people's max rep. It was where obviously you have like the 10 athletes who have lifted these and can lift these, but even then they're more fatigued because, they've lifted not only the first sets, but then also the second sets. And now they're having to lift the final 4 bars. It was really fun. My guy, Justin Medeiros, won that event. So I was really happy about that. I remember we all stood up because people in front of us stood up. So we had to stand up. And then those people behind us have to stand up because we stood up. And so all that to say is that I was jumping. I was buzzing out of my seat. I had my fanny pack. I was like, yeah. And so like the mood really started to change. And again, I still have that like internal dialogue and internal thought of like, it feels weird. Like it feels weird cheering on my my favorite athletes, because I have no idea how they're grieving, and maybe they're just trying to get out there and just do their best. Like Danielle Brandon even posted, she was like, yeah, like I remember like after a certain event, I was just going to like hang it up and retire. That's how I was feeling. And that's very rightfully so. Like I feel, and maybe this isn't so much like death related, but when you maybe don't have like the race you want, or you don't have the video you upload you want, and it's just like, you just get so mad, or like you're talking to a girl or a guy and they blow you off and they ghost you and it feels weird, and it's like, I'm sick and done with this. Like I just don't want to do with anything. It's kind of like this really weird grieving process that people go through that's very human. And so, again, it felt weird as a spectator to, cheer them on, and it feels weird to kind of like root for them in a way that, maybe that's their coaches, or maybe that's like other people that's like super, super close to you in the lane, and it's quiet. You're like, oh, Justin, and, it feels weird. And so I think the biggest thing is don't feel bad about doing that, because I think even in the moment I necessarily didn't until like afterwards. And so obviously as we go through clean ladder, again, a super fun event, push-pull 2.0, kind of similar to what they had last year at the games, but maybe without any double unders. We had hardly any jump ropes. I feel like that would have been in the first day, but they had hardly any of that. Push-pull 2.0 was really fun because you had to do a lot of handstand push-ups, which is really fun, which is kind of why it was called push-pull 2.0. It seems like they had another event that was very much like it, being 1.0. So yeah, but then the final day went really smooth, but it felt weird because you kind of realize that it's coming to an end, and you just hope that there's something for Lazar and his family, and they ended up having like a memorial video for him, which I thought was really cool. I don't know who ended up editing it, but I wish they maybe had done more. And like, it's hard when I have like these what ifs and these like, I would hope those little thoughts of like, I want there to be more, and I think just as a fan, it's so out of my control. I don't have a decision in how that video is edited. I don't have a shirt that says media. I'm not calling the shots on these, but that's why I feel like I can use my platform in this podcast to kind of tell you guys as a spectator what had gone on. I'm sure most of you guys that are watching this, maybe hadn't even known what CrossFit is, or maybe knew a little bit about it, or had made fun of the chest to bar pull-ups that they do. I understand. But I guess the biggest thing that I'm trying to get at is that I hope that even if I'm not in a position to make those decisions, that I can still give some insight on what it was like and my thought process of the event, it continuing, athletes getting a choice, and what they did for Lazar as a memorial and a tribute. And, it felt weird. I mean, the final 2/3 events, basically 2 sections, but 3 events, because the final event had 2 parts to it, one being scored and then the second part being scored of it. So again, 2 sections, but 3 events. Fun way to kind of end off. It had a very volatile ending because some people were really good at the first portion and others weren't really good, or you really like sucked at one portion or the other, like I mentioned, or you were good at both or not good at both. So had a lot of volatile endings to the leaderboard, and I thought it was really fun. It was a rather shorter day. I think things started off a little later. Maybe it was sooner. I think they were supposed to come in at 9. Yeah, when it was supposed to be 11. So yeah, that was that. I've watched a lot of videos after the games talking about the PFA and the Professional Fitness Athletes Association, and what they've been doing, and watched different perspectives on athletes and what they know and saw, and what criteria that they do. And it just feels like there's a lot of holes within the organization of CrossFit. Like for me, and I get as an organization, maybe they don't need like a physical or they don't need stuff, but it concerns me in a way that maybe they don't have proper medical things to go in. beforehand, because even for like high school, I need that. I need a physical every 2 years. I need to make sure that I'm able to compete and I don't have any of these, heart murmurs, or I have, high blood pressure, or I have diabetes that I'm not controlling. So with that, post CrossFit conversation has been rather intriguing. I feel like there's a lot of insights, like I mentioned, like the Jeff Adler stuff, whether you believe it or not. And I think people point holes into that story, but I think it's still vital information. Some people have even said, like, even on a Garmin, like in water, the GPS isn't great. But for myself, I've had like Whoop bands and I've had stuff like that, and it's worked just fine in water. So I don't exactly know what that looks like and where we go from here, but I hope that there is change. I hope that somebody's brought to the table. I don't feel like it needs to be like a guillotine where we're going to spearhead somebody and point fingers and somebody needs to get axed from the company. I don't mind if that's the results. I don't really care if that's the results. Again, as a spectator and somebody who's only watched this for this being my third year in a way, I can wholeheartedly say that I don't watch enough or care enough for it to be, but post this games, I'm a little bit more invested. I'm a lot more invested in that way, where that community aspect that CrossFit always kind of harps on. And maybe I'm not like an affiliate always doing something. I have my own stuff here, but I've followed the athletes. I care more about the athletes than the organization. I want to watch them compete. I want to watch my favorite athletes on the highest stage. It doesn't matter if they're at Wadapalooza, the games. It doesn't matter if that Rogue Invitational. I do not care. I want to watch high-level fitness, and that's what excuse me, I burped, not cried. That's what I came to watch. And I don't care if that's like an unsanctioned event where they're just in the backyard of somebody's ranch and they're competing. I just want to watch it. I've started to watch a little bit more videos talking about like the topics. I feel like I kind of want to disconnect myself from that for a bit. Especially with this whole thing going on and speculation, it felt like a lot like Ocean Gate in a way. Like right as it happened, we're like, oh my gosh, like hopefully he's okay. Prayers up and all sorts of things to kind of like, you just pray and hope at that point. 3 hours in the water is a world record if he was able to hold his breath, but that's not the case. And it's tragic that it happened, especially on the watch and, who's to blame and what went on. And I think a lot of people are really looking for that right now, where they're really looking for somebody to be at the table and to be like, I effed up. And I think the biggest thing that you can do if you're a CrossFit fan or if you're, somebody looking for answers is just wait. Again, I'm not in a position to ask for or demand for answers. I certainly can, just because I may not have a voice that can make change, I can be the change that people need to hear. And for that, again, just be mindful in the comments if you are a CrossFit fan or have been in the comments. I've kind of started to disconnect myself from that. I kind of put into perspective of like other events in a way of like, oh, but what about if this were like the Olympics and somebody like happened to drown during like the triathlon portion or the marathon swim? Like what happens then? Do they cancel the Olympics? Like I understand that every place is going to have a different decision, that makes it very, very difficult for organizers and people, that have a lot of power in a way to make those decisions. I would understand if the Olympics continued. I understand and understood that the CrossFit Games continued. But I try and put myself into like, what about if like the Olympics, what about if this happened during then, do they cancel that event? Do they cancel, like what happens, like I just, I don't know what happens then. And I hope that we never know what happens because it seems like they have the medical and the provisions for that, where there are people on the water there to watch. And, there's a certain ratio of athletes to, paddleboarders, kayaks, whatever they may be, to be there for safety and for their, own benefit. not at their own detriment and their own death, especially drowning. It's tragic that it all went on. Like I said, I do want to kind of disconnect myself from that conversation. But in a more lighthearted note, I want to talk about a little bit of the Olympics. I won't probably talk about much of it, but allow me to take a sip of water. My mouth is very dry at this current moment in time. I was watching a little bit of the Olympics while I was at the CrossFit Games down in Fort Worth while I was in our hotel. We watched a lot, especially the day of. No events, the first day. But I do want to watch and talk about, I do want to talk about the top 10 moments that I saw during this year's Olympics. Now, there's a bunch of sports that I watched. I watched rugby for the first time. I watched a bunch of swimming. I watched track and field, of course. I watched basketball, of course. I ended up watching just a bunch of different events like the triathlon, road racing, and mountain biking. Those were all a bunch of fun events to watch, and a lot of gymnastics that I watched. I didn't watch too much of the individual, but I watched a lot of the all-around and a bunch of the team-based gymnastics, and love synchronized swimming. Apparently, I don't know if you guys knew this. I watched this in a reaction video the other day. Apparently in, I think like the 78, 82, and 86, apparently they had solo synchronized swimming, which sounds a little oxymoronic because solo synchronized. How does that work? But regardless, I do want to talk about some of my top moments of this year's Olympics. One of them being an honorable mention. Right as the Olympics were beginning, LeBron James and Coco Gauff, the flag bearers for this year's Olympics. LeBron James, the shot of him in the rain coming down and on the boat as Team USA's coming across the Seine River for the opening ceremony and all the flags and all whatnot. But LeBron James, the Captain America, leading USA across the Delaware. I'm going to be telling my kids that that's what happened in good old 24. But then across that, in number 10, I had Ðukić being the face of the 2024 Olympics. I love the celebrations. Even like Mondo Duplantis, who won a world record right after that, celebrated with the hand in pocket and kind of like the pistol fingers. Super cool. There's a bunch of different athletes that had that celebration as well. But Ðukić was that guy. They had the South Korean like the day before, and then I woke up and it was Ðukić, who was even more badass than anyone that came before him. So in my 10th spot was that. In my number 9 spot, I do have Zhao Yuqin, the Chinese athlete. I believe she's like a teenager. She looks rather young, like most of the gymnasts do. And it was so wholesome. She got a silver medal, I believe. And they had the two Italians to her left, and they were all biting their medals and whatnot. And she looks over and is like, oh, it was so wholesome. It was so wholesome. One of the best photos and one of the best moments. And speaking of the best moments, I got to talk about the Gabriel Medina photo of him at surfing. It's a super iconic surfing photo that you guys probably had seen. Super cool, like where he's pointing up against the water or up in the air, floating, defying gravity. One of the best Olympic photos. Maybe it doesn't have a whole lot of meaning. I'm sure there's probably some out there that are a little bit more iconic for that way. But I will have to say that, especially this year and probably all Olympic photos, is one of the best. So kudos out to the photographer. I forget his name, but kudos out to him because that was a fantastic photo and a great moment, first and foremost. Excuse me. Next up in the 6th spot, the 7th spot, I do have Steven Nedorowczyk, the sleeper agent for the USA men's team in gymnastics, where his only job, by the way, is to do the pommel horse. It's his only job. Now, if you don't know, you're supposed to put a certain amount of athletes forth for each event. So you want somebody who's all around really good for gymnastics. So you don't want them to just be good at one thing, but you want them to be good all around. And it's funny, because his only job is to do the pommel horse. And he helped earn USA their first bronze medal, or first medal for the past 16 years. So, and happened to be bronze. So congratulations to Steven and the team over at USA. And again, another USA, Kristen Faulkner's gold medal road race finish. I happen to be the first USA women's gold medal in road racing in 40 years, since its inception, actually. Kristen Faulkner, she was, so there's two racers, two cyclists up in front, and there's her, Kristen, and another athlete. They're in third and fourth, and they're just kind of drafting off each other. They're trying to work back. That's how cycling works, is where you kind of like, even if they are opponents, you have to work together if you want to catch the lead group. And that's kind of the point, is no matter what, is that like you kind of have to use your opponents to your advantage. Because if you don't, they're not helping you and you're not helping them. You're never, the thing is that there's an ultimatum. Either you don't help, and that's fine, but you'll never catch the people up in front. Or if you do, it's going to be a lot harder. Or you do help, and now you're all up there within them. So the third and fourth, Christian being one of them, they're moving up into 1-2. It's like the gap was like 7, and then it was 6 seconds, and it was 5 seconds. And apparently it got down, and they're in 1 through 4, and Christian just slingshots herself. Just whoop. She just continues and just sprints ahead of the rest of them. Because none of them want to sprint. They're all so tired. But she had to, you have to just do what you got to do. And it was just so ballsy because it was at such an inflection point where, anyone could have done it. It just happened to be her. But it was so ballsy because then she had to ride like the rest of the kilometers. It was like 2 or 3 by herself, which is extremely hard. But none of them just had an answer. And the thing is you'll see a lot of this in cycling where a lot of people have answers where they try and go out and they're like, oh, come on. But then they just slowly reel them back in. It's not early enough. They don't, cycling is a lot about attacks and defenses. And that's kind of what cycling, especially road racing, Tour de France type-esque, is about. You attack and you cover. So that's my number 6 spot there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, there we go. Top 5 here. We have Safan Hassan's gold medal marathon finished. She apparently ran over 62 kilometers during this year's Olympics competitively. That's a few semifinals and 5,000 meter qualifications, a 10K final, and maybe a qualification, I'm not too sure. But then on top of that, also a marathon to add on top of that. So she got bronze, one due to a disqualification by Faith Kipyegon, in the 5,000 meter, which ended up putting her from 4th to 3rd, ended up getting a bronze. And then on top of that, in the 10K, she also got a bronze medal as well. But this time in the marathon, she was out for a gold medal finish, and it was epic. I'm sure you guys might have seen the video of her and the Ethiopian to her right, and they like kind of collide, and man, it was so insane. Like sprinting after running 26 plus miles and having to sprint the quarter mile like it's nothing. And for a gold medal is life. You'll never ever forget that moment. It was so cool to watch because I watched the marathon, went to bed, and then funny enough that I found out that had happened. So number 4, I have Noah Lyles' 5,000th margin win over Thompson from Jamaica in the men's 100 meter final. I actually just woke up, turned on my PC, turned on track and field because I knew it would probably be going on at that time. And it just so happens that they just are lining up. And I was like, oh my God. He did not do well in the preliminary, in the semis. Oh, great heavens. But pulled out, and especially didn't have a great finish. I was like, oh man, I have no idea, because I was watching from my bed, which is a little further than where this camera's at. And I was like, oh my God. Crazy. In 4th place, this happened a little bit earlier in the Olympics, but Alex Spiff Cedric's 94-meter truck and run to the house as the clock expires for USA's first ever rugby sevens medal in the women's side. Crazy, because I remember hearing about that they won, and so I go rewatch the match, and they were against Australia, and Australia scores late, and they're trying to go up a handful of points, but I was like, oh my God, I don't know how they win this. The clock's like at 34. They just kicked it. They're, tossing it right, tossing it left. They scramble, put it under. Alona Mar gets it, puts it on the ground after getting tackled. And then one girl gets it from behind like a snap would be in the NFL, pitches it out right. And then Alex just barrels over one girl and runs to the house as time expires. It was so electric. 12 seconds left on the clock, and she just sprinting down for their first ever women's 7 rugby medal, which is insane. So that's my number 3. Number 4, excuse me, that's not how that works. Number 2, we have Stephen Curry's 5-minute hot hand. 4 3-pointers to beat France in the gold medal match, yet alone hitting 3 threes beforehand, and the 4th being what I would arguably say is the best basketball shot of all time. Fade away to the right, 2 men on him, KD to his left, even more left is LeBron James, and Stephen Curry takes the 3, and it's wet. It's wet. Oh my God. The greatest shot of all time. Because, like, it's not like he just hit, like, 3 threes and they were, like, winning by a big margin. Like, it obviously helped, but, like, France just kept coming. They were getting fouls. They were getting shots in. They were getting threes up. And so Stephen Curry single-handedly, you know, turned on the hot hand, turned on the takeover. I don't know what that 5-minute takeover was for Stephen Curry, but it was electric, and that gets my number 2 spot because also it's Stephen Curry as well. Beyond that, in my number 1 spot, I don't know if anyone's going to guess this, but I do have another track one. And no, it's not Sydney McLaughlin-Leroney in her world record run, even though that was crazy. Anna Cockrell in 2nd place, crazy. But it was Quincy Hall's 100-meter comeback in the 400-meter finals. Now, I don't know if you guys have watched this or if you guys have ever ran any sort of track event, even a 400 at all-out pace, but let me tell you something. That final 100 meters, you are tunnel visioned. The world gets a little blurry. Your body starts aching. And you're running, like, I've done this and I've ran like 55 seconds, 54 splits. Never, ever have I ran 10 seconds faster than that. 44 seconds. In a race where I've already ran prelims and semifinals, but yet alone doing that to go win the gold medal. Quincy Hall, you deserve number 1 because that final 100 meters where everyone's just on cruise control at that point. Nobody's like gaining positions. You see a few here and there depending on how fast they went out the blocks and obviously off the curve. But in lane like 7, maybe 6, to go out and go get it. He was fighting demons, Nationers. He was fighting something. He had an out-of-body experience during that final 100 meters. And he didn't win it until like 395 meters. And that's why it's a 400-meter race. And it's not over until it's over, until everyone crosses that finish line. And that deserves my number 1 spot. Nation, thank you guys again so much for watching today's episode. If you guys have any thoughts on the CrossFit, if you guys want any more clarification, maybe you have any questions on maybe things that I discussed or where to find things, let me know down in the comment section below. Thank you guys again so much for watching. This is a little different episode. I kind of wanted to talk about the tragedy that happened over at the CrossFit Games and what they're doing, what I was doing, where my process was as a fan. But thank you guys again so much for watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button down below. Thank you guys so much for listening if you guys are watching on audio platforms. And of course, Nation, I'll see you guys in the next one. Episode 62, banner right behind me. I forgot to say it at the beginning of the episode, but I love you guys. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you guys later. 07. Peace.